Opponents of Republican Congressman Darrell Issa have never stopped campaigning. They meet, march, and chant weekly at his Vista office. Construction of a massive housing development in Chula Vista hits a snag after methane and other volatile chemicals are detected. And starting next month, California becomes the latest state to legalize recreational marijuana within its borders. Are we ready? I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Allison St. John, North County reporter for KPBS News, reporter Brad Racino of iNewsSource, and reporter Gary Robbins of the San Diego Union Tribune. Well, they show up every Tuesday. Many are voters outraged by Donald Trump's ascent to the White House, the target of their wrath, 9-term Republican Darrell Issa. Their slogan is Flip the 49th, and they march and chant for an hour each week outside the congressman's Vista office. Now, Allison, tell us how many people show up there and what is their purpose? They think they can really unseat this entrenched incumbent. They almost did last time.
Well, basically, yeah, this has become sort of the place to be for people who are not happy with what's going on in Washington, D.C. When I go there, I see about 200 people, but they tell me that people come and go, so they take names, and there's about 350 people that show up most weeks. And it really is sort of a gathering of the clans for the people who really are hoping to unseat Trump and maybe are pro-Planned Parenthood, more interested in climate change and gun regulations, that kind of thing. It's a lot of different interest groups that gather there on the one side of the street. On the other side of the street, you have just a handful of people who are pro-Issa demonstrators, including somebody who has a very loud megaphone, Steve Hasty. He is actually the founder of the local Tea Party. Mm-hmm. And so it gets pretty loud sometimes with the two loudspeakers kind of clashing across the road. But I would say there's really quite a good sort of community feel about the place. You know, they respect each other. It really is democracy in action. It
really is. It's kind of performance art every week, democracy in action, as you say. So people showing up every week, why do they say they come out every week? Because there were predictions a year ago, they said, oh, this will peter out. It's not going to continue, right?
I think it's become kind of a social gathering place for people. You know, Tom Steyer showed up, who wants to impeach Trump.
The billionaire, we've seen him on the ads and has the whole impeach Trump.
So if you want to find a place where people who are dissatisfied with what's going on in Washington, D.C., that's a good place to go. And I think people see it as kind of a social place where they can have their values reinforced and find people of like mind. And sometimes there's kind of a party atmosphere there. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's also some mutual respect, I think. You know, they have a theme each week. And one week they had a theme of veterans issues. Both sides of the street had veterans to speak on the microphone, and both sides were quiet when the other side was speaking, so they could listen to what the other one said. So they're pretty well organized. They have people who help you cross the street if you want to go talk to the other side. It's a whole scene. It's quite an interesting place to be.
Brad?
What is it about Issa in particular that makes him such a divisive figure here in San Diego? You don't see this happening with a lot of other politicians. Is it all anti-Trump, or is it something about Issa himself?
Well, I think the blood in the water phenomenon, the fact that he's so nearly lost his seat, a 9-term incumbent, everybody thought it was sure he'd win, and then last November he only won by half a point to Doug Applegate. And of course, if you're looking at Democrats attempting to overturn a number of congressional seats, change the balance of power, this is a seat that has become a kind of a focus nationally.
Mm-hmm. Gary?
Why doesn't the Issa side have more people at these meetings? I mean, he's been a congressman for a very long time. He knows how to get people out. It seems kind of odd that so few people in an organized way would come out.
You're right. It's just a very few handful of people. Well, Steve Hasty says it's because they're all working, and he accuses the people on the other side of the street of being paid to be there. That's the standard line of the Republicans is, you know, we're hardworking folks. Those guys are all students and retired people, which is, I have to tell you, not at all the case. There's all kinds of people there, and many of them have changed their schedules in order to be able to attend this rally.
And your story noted that there's no evidence, really, that anybody's being paid to be there, right?
Yes, I mean, the person who's organizing it, Ellen Montanari, says, I am not being paid. In fact, I'm losing money by being here. Nobody else here is being paid. And there are some things going on in the district where there are some paid organizers, but these rallies are basically all volunteer.
And your story also noted that there's been, a $400,000, I believe was the figure, campaign against ISA. Has some big names behind that super PAC, right?
Well, yes. So there's a separate super PAC called Flip the 49.
Right. And many, we should say, all sorts of politicians have super PACs these days. That's a pretty natural
Well,
thing.
yes, if you're going to win, you know, it isn't something which is part of the campaign of the candidates. It's an independent
Political Action Committee.
Political Action Committee, correct. And so they've gotten off the ground to a very early start and raised $400,000 from a lot of people in Hollywood. Obviously, Darrell Isa's district runs from Orange County down to La Jolla. So Hollywood is a little north of that, but they're keeping an eye on this. So people like Leonardo DiCaprio, Bill Maher, Jay Leno, Jane Fonda, they have all contributed to this super PAC, including also Irwin Jacobs of San Diego's Qualcomm. So they've started to raise some money, and this is being spent on grassroots campaigning. So they're starting to organize much earlier than you would normally see. I mean, we're a whole year away from the election.
Yeah, you were telling me earlier that maybe new wrinkles with the super PAC approach and how sophisticated they're getting for the next election, the next go-round in 2018.
Yes, I think this is going to affect how we get lobbied in this coming year. We've been used to seeing...
We as voters, yeah.
We as voters,
yeah.
Correct. You know, we've been used to seeing mailers pouring through the mailbox, right? Now they've discovered that actually the most effective way to reach people is social media. And the super PACs are realizing that they need to really start investing in grassroots campaigning, not necessarily knocking on doors, but by figuring out what your issues are, possibly from looking at Facebook or anything else, and then sending you ads on Facebook and reaching out to you through all these
more directed ways.
More direct ways.
Gary?
There was that rumor in our newsroom about a week ago that Jane Fonda was actually coming down to go to one of the rallies. Did that actually happen?
I don't believe she went to a rally, but she did attend a fundraiser here. And so one of those fundraisers, I believe she contributed about $100,000 of that $400,000.
Do you know how it went over? I mean, in a military community like this, that and the word Jane Fonda.
Well, it's interesting because the military community is fragmented, I would say, and there are veterans on both sides of the street.
And his opponent was a military guy last time around, Applegate.
Doug Applegate is, in fact, a Marine colonel, that's correct. So there are some military folks who are in the anti-ISA camp who feel very strongly that the way that veterans are being treated is not good enough, that Washington is not coming through with the resources that veterans deserve, and that they want somebody different to be representing them. I have not heard anybody express negatively about Jane Fonda, but I think what's interesting is that there are a lot of different interests that don't necessarily agree, that are all coming together under this flag, that feel like what we want to do is change the political makeup of this congressional district, this seat. And actually it hasn't changed in terms of registration as far as they would like, but they're hoping that in spite of the fact that Darrell Issa still has a Republican advantage among registered voters, they are determined to make that shift. And coastal Republicans in San Diego County are an interesting bunch. I mean, I think, you know, we saw Kristen Gasper fighting very hard to keep that Republican. There's a difference between coastal Republicans in San Diego County and in the rest of the county. So some of those sharp dividing lines are blurring.
Who besides Applegate is already running? Is there a crowded field on the Democratic side?
There are 4 people who've jumped in. Yes, there's Mike Levin, who is an environmental attorney who comes from Orange County, and I should make the point that Orange County was where Issa won. He actually lost in San Diego. So Mike Levin's up there, and then you have Paul Kerr, who is a Rancho Santa Fe resident and a businessman, real estate investor, and then you have Sarah Jacobs, who just jumped in, who has been a State Department employee, who has worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign as a foreign policy advisor, and she's also Irwin Jacobs' granddaughter.
Well, so you can see that it's going to be a very interesting primary coming up here, and who knows what's going to happen. But that district in recent years has changed in its makeup, right? That's why Applegate came so close last time.
Well, yes. It is gradually changing, and I mean, I can imagine that that's part of the Democrat strategy, is to try to change voter registration. Right now, there's about 2,000 more Republicans than Democrats registered to vote, even in San Diego, and much more than that in Orange County. It's very heavily Republican. So I think in the next year there'll probably be a huge push to see if that can be pushed a little further.
So it'll really come down to turnout, as so many of these do. We'll have to see what happens.
It will definitely come down to turnout.
Fascinating race, and it'll probably get a lot of national attention as we move into election year 2018. Feels like we're already there in that election year. Well, we're going to move on. One of the largest planned housing developments in the country is being built in Chula Vista. But homebuyers were prevented from moving in because methane and certain volatile chemicals were discovered underground there. So, Brad, start with that basic reason. What happened there, and why did they kind of halt that whole process?
So back in April, there were some construction workers that were digging a trench in the Ascaya development down in Chula Vista, and they came across some perched groundwater. It looked like an oily sheen, so they alerted the developer to it. Well, the next month or two, they did some tests and found that there was methane and other volatile chemicals coming through. So that kicked off this back and forth with the Otay Water District and the County Department of Environmental Health to see, okay, how big is this problem? What does it mean? What does it mean for home buyers? Because the developer was advertising that people are going to be moving in by Christmas. So that started this whole thing, and what ended up happening was the water district was not comfortable issuing or releasing water meters until it had assurances from the developer that these chemicals were not going to affect any of the pipes or facilities, because the water district, once development is done, has responsibility over that infrastructure.
They take all that over.
Yes, they would be liable. Yeah. So they wanted complete assurances from that.
Okay. Now, give us an idea of the scope here. How big is this development? How many homes?
It's pretty big. We went down there a couple weekends ago. It's planned for 992 homes, commercial space, a park, at least one school. I think it's on about 450 acres, but I should mention this is only one part. This is like the first development of a much larger phase of, I think it's going to be 22,000 acres of all the villages in Otay Ranch.
Wow.
So this is a huge, huge development.
Yeah, and who is the developer behind this project?
It's a developer called HomeFed. They're based out of Carlsbad. They've done a lot of development around California and I think also Chicago and Florida, but they've been in the game for a couple decades so far.
Allison?
How do you mitigate for methane? I mean, obviously the residents who are moving in want to feel secure that they're not going to be affected.
Well, I'll try and sound as scientific as I can, but I don't know. Basically, what they're doing is installing these slabs that will stop the chemicals or the gases from coming up from the ground, and they're also installing ventilation and pipes in houses that have already been built. So what HomeFed has told us is that, first of all, the concentrations are not that big. There's only one spot that was tested that had really high levels of methane. The others, they've told us, and the County Department of Environmental Health has confirmed, are so low that the mitigation that they're already installing or have installed is more than enough to make sure that everyone is safe.
But what is it doing to the property values of people who have been purchasing in there and are suddenly thinking, maybe I don't want to live there?
I don't know about the actual property value. I know that HomeFed told us that 18 out of 196 home buyers have pulled out and have cited methane as the issue that they're pulling out.
And they gave them that option, right?
Yeah, they gave them the option. They disclosed in their initial disclosure papers in June that, hey, you're next to a landfill. It didn't say anything about the testing because that hadn't been completed yet. Once the testing was done in August, HomeFed sent another disclosure to all home buyers, gave them the option to get out, get their full return, and they told us that a number of people have taken that option.
But couldn't the methane been discovered long before the project even started in the process of analyzing what's there?
That's the next thing we're looking into, is how did this even happen? So you're next to a giant landfill, you're next to salvage yards, wrecking yards, then there's an aggregate commercial zone right next door.
Permits require soils testing, this sort of thing?
Yeah, so how did it get this far? And when I talked to HomeFed, I said, wasn't there an environmental impact report that happened before? And they said, yeah, there were numbers of them. And I said, did it disclose this? They said no, and we sure wish it had, because it would have impacted the purchase price that we paid for this. So they wanted this to be known well before this happened, but it has not been.
All right. Now, you said, you reported this week also in your story, it's not unusual for large housing developments in California to experience this sort of thing, right?
Yeah, this happens up and down the state. It can happen for a number of reasons. One of the most interesting things I learned is that it can happen naturally when developers are moving large amounts of earth. So when you move, for this development, they move 7 million cubic yards of dirt. Doing that makes an organic process happen, and that can naturally produce methane. So developers up and down the state have dealt with this for years. There's already ways to mitigate that. They know how to do it. This is not even really a concern for most developers. They just know that it's part of the thing they do.
Okay, and the Otay Water District had refused to put in water meters, as we noted. They say it will now continue, though, the work on the water meters.
Right. I talked to a spokeswoman on Tuesday, I think, and she had told me that they now have all the paperwork that they needed from HomeFed, all of the analyses, all the research to show that this is not an issue, and they plan to release the water meters, I believe, in the next week or so.
I should imagine that developers in the future will be much more careful about checking for methane before they start in the future.
I would think so, because this is going to cost, HomeFed told us, $8,000 to $10,000 a house to go in and already fix. So that's probably about $1.5 million.
Short time left. We mentioned at the outset, besides the methane, there were some other chemicals involved here. They know, first of all, what are the levels on those, and secondly, what's the source on those?
We still don't know the source. There's benzene, there's some other very large chemical names that I can't pronounce. But they basically have a chemical signature as if they came from what appears to be the auto yards or wrecking yards, possibly the landfill. But the County Department of Environmental Health and HomeFed are now really aggressively looking for who's to blame for this, because honestly they want to recoup the costs that they're having to pay because of this.
And it's not just the water folks, as you say, who will be responsible for the piping and everything when the project's completed, but there's a school there that's going to be involved at some point, private companies or anything?
There's a Chula Vista Elementary School District. They're going to put a school in there. There was a charter school, the Stephen Hawking Charter School, that was planned to go on actually the largest spot of methane, but they've since pulled out. HomeFed tells us it's not due to the methane, it was due to other reasons, but they're out of there, but there still is a school plan.
All right, we'll see what happens going forward and the follow-ups on that and what happens with that big development out there. Well, people have been buying and selling recreational marijuana for decades in California, a grassroots network, so to speak. Now that underground commerce is emerging into the world of regulation and sales tax and permits and inspections, and California cities like San Diego and Oceanside can look elsewhere to see what's working well. And we're right up against it, aren't we, Gary? Because they got to figure all this out here. Now, you would think that since we've been selling medical marijuana, or at least distributing it, since 1996, we'd have something in place. But your plan is, your story is that the planning and the chaos is kind of going hand in hand.
It has been very chaotic. So as of January 1st, you'll be able to buy recreational marijuana at one of these licensed stores, and only at licensed stores. You can buy an ounce a day if you're just Joe Average. If you're someone with a medical card, you can buy up to 8 ounces a day. But the state has had to scramble all year to get ready to do that. The permits from the state allowing these stores to do it are just coming in as we're sitting here speaking. I was at a store yesterday that got one of the licenses. Wow. It appears there'll be about a dozen in San Diego, and only in San Diego.
In the city?
Yes, in the city of San Diego,
right.
Not elsewhere in the county.
Right.
The reality is that 70% of the counties and the cities in the state of California have said no.
They've opted out.
They have. A lot of them want to see what's going to happen. Right. So they're looking to places like San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco to see how it's carried out.
Right.
What's interesting to me is the fact that in almost all these cities, a majority of the voters voted to legalize it, right?
Right.
But then when the city councils hold meetings saying, okay, well, how shall we regulate this? They get barraged with an onslaught of people coming saying, no, we don't want it in our community. And so, politically speaking, they feel obliged to say, no, okay, we won't even regulate it, we'll just keep it illegal, which is such a short-sighted policy, really, because, initiatives are likely to come on the ballot next year, right?
Right.
And then the voters will have a say again.
The stigma problem. Yeah. That's what the bottom line here is. So people, if you ask them, do you agree with the idea that marijuana should be legal? People say yes. But when it comes to actually going ahead and selling it, there's a difference, because there's still a stigma attached to the sale of marijuana, whether it's for medical marijuana or recreational purposes. The industry behind it isn't very good at speaking to the general public. They speak to people who use the marijuana stores, but this is all about going more broadly, of selling it to you and you and you. I mean, baby boomers, middle-aged people, mothers, normalizing it, mainstreaming it like you do with beer. And they haven't done a very good job of that yet. Now, they're limited in a lot of ways with what they can market, where they can say what. They cannot advertise in the Union Tribune, for example. But the industry hasn't been very good yet at saying, hey, this is nothing really that different. You shouldn't be locking us out of your communities. And I think that as we go along in January, February, March, we'll see how that plays out, and whether in fact that's the case.
Trying to overcome the whole reefer madness, decades of drug war.
And there's a lot of silly stigma with it, because the reality is that medical marijuana is broadly used in California for a lot of very valid reasons.
Well, you got the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, who says, you know, good people don't smoke marijuana. You've still got the possibility of the feds cracking down in states like California that will have it legal now.
It's such an interesting setup because you have Jeff Sessions saying that, but at the same time you have the entire state of California just kind of swatting him back.
Ignoring it.
I mean, the Secretary of the Treasury said, I think we may need armored cars to go around to all the marijuana dispensaries and pick up the taxes. The state of California wants this to happen. Right. I was getting all these phone calls last week about the state saying, you know, we have this new webpage next week that's going to make it easy for you to start a business. So California, the largest state, really wants it. And as we talked about before, there's kind of this tidal wave happening because California has it legal. Nevada, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, beginning next summer, all of Canada. So it's sweeping across the nation. The person I talked to a couple days ago down at Otay Mesa said, I think this is like same-sex marriage. I think that it gets passed by most communities across the nation, and then the government goes,
There's a tipping point, and it goes on. Well, it's a nice segue from what you were saying. There's a public service announcement here with Cheech, famously of Cheech and Chong. We'll play a clip from that.
Hi, I want to start a cannabis business. Am I in the right place?
Yep. Or you can go to cannabisfile.sos.ca.gov.
Wait, what about business forms and stuff like licensing and tax info?
Well, you could do it in person.
And for the folks on the radio, that was Cheech, and much older than we remember from those Up in Smoke movies.
I think that hurts. I think that if you were doing that it might be an entirely different thing because they're just trying to normalize it. With him, he's an icon, and there's baggage associated
part of the
with
counterculture.
And the county, you know, the state simply wants to say, hey, this is normal. Come start a business. You know, here's the face of business.
How have other states actually normalized it? What lessons can California learn?
Well, Colorado has been pretty good at it because they keep tweaking it to try to satisfy everybody's interest. And now there's conversation in that state about, do you have lounges where you could smoke it publicly? Because you can't in Colorado. So there's this big discussion out there like, well, it should be as easy as craft beer. You know, it should be as accessible. It is no different. It is not more dangerous.
In other words, go to the brewery and enjoy a beer, go to a lounge and enjoy marijuana.
So there's real discussions in Colorado, but you know who might beat them? The state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts has approved recreational marijuana. They're going to do it next year. They're having really serious discussions in Boston and its outlying communities about should we have these bars where people can sample.
And we should be clear, that's not on the plan right now for California. You buy it from a retailer, you use it privately, right?
Right. And what yes, it's private. It's primarily in your home. What the retailers will tell you is that if they just start it and a lot of people show up and it's pretty calm and there are no real problems, then more and more people will use it. They're really thinking that the people who are going to sell it are women because they think that they have been pushed out of this whole discussion about marijuana. So there's companies like this one up in Tustin where they bake cookies. They're little mini toaster cookies, and they use it and sell it as a woman's product and as a wellness product. You want to fall asleep at night, take one of our little toaster cookies and invite your friends over and socialize over this edible marijuana.
Maybe Hillary Clinton will be home baking cookies after all, as she said so many years ago. Allison, you've talked about some other cities in the county having this battle. Is Oceanside going to opt in at some point? Or?
I mean, who knows? The city of San Diego is just miles ahead of all the other cities in the county and the backcountry as well, the unincorporated areas. Oceanside has a couple of people on the council who really see this as being, you know, we want to keep control of this. We don't want to just let there be an initiative in November that then passes it and on their terms and we lose control. So they would like to have an ordinance which would allow up to 4 dispensaries, allow some delivery, allow growing, because there's a lot of agricultural land in Oceanside. Yeah. However, that's votes coming up in the new year, and it's really unclear as to, you know, whether they will get that vote. And I just feel like it's going to be such a challenge for people in the county to know, where do I live? What is the regulation in my city? Because every city is going to be slightly different.
Right.
And then enforcing it is going to be hard, because if you stop someone and they say, I thought this was legal, and they say, yes, it is, but not exactly what you're doing in this particular place, will there be a little bit of leniency, I wonder, about the way it's enforced? Because
I'm not sure about that, but we're running a map of the 11 or 12 stores that will start the year selling it because there's a lot of confusion.
Yes.
San Diego is a big city, so from Bay Park to Otay Mesa, there's a lot of, you're right, there's a lot of confusion over that. So we're going to run that map to say, these are the boundaries where you could go legally buy it, and here's what you should do if you buy it. Like, put it in your car, do not unseal it under any circumstances.
Right.
Put it in your trunk.
Yes.
Do not go into Mexico with it. Don't go to Nevada where it's legal because it's across state lines.
Don't get on an airplane with it.
Exactly.
And even delivery services is different because in Oceanside they have legalized delivery from dispensaries somewhere else, in other words in San Diego City. But many cities don't even allow delivery in North County.
They're going to allow recreational delivery, but this is a really risky thing because remember, this is a cash business.
Oh,
they can't take credit cards. And so these people that are doing deliveries are carrying a lot of money.
Well, plenty of follow-ups, and we'll be watching anxiously as the year turns and all this happens and watching for your stories on that. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Allison St. John of KPBS News, Brad Racino of iNewsSource, and Gary Robbins of the San Diego Union Tribune. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. And a sad note before we leave today, Dick Enberg, the great sports announcer who narrated notable events for decades and more recently was the voice of the Padres, has died. Our condolences to Mr. Enberg's family. I'm Mark Sauer. Have a Merry Christmas and join us next week for a special roundup of the 2017 on the Roundtable.